that's there. And so what I've tried to do with this topic today is take a look at the conditions, the issues that trees have that are not insect and that are not diseases, plant diseases, whether that's a virus or a fungus or bacterial or any of those types of things. It's all the rest, which I think you'll see as we go through here. The insect and the disease problems of our trees are really much, much less than these other things, these abiotic things. And there's, I would say, probably 70% of the tree issues that I look at are really one of these seven categories here. So I broke these out just to kind of make things a little bit easier uh, to to touch on today into these seven categories. And we're gonna look at each of these in steps. So we got cultural, soil issues, biological issues of the plant itself. Weather, that's a big one. There's a lot of pieces that fit under weather. We're currently in the middle of one right now that could be impacting some of your trees. Animal, those are usually pretty easy to figure out if it's an animal issue. So we'll talk briefly about that. Mechanical, or you might say the human issue related to trees and how we do certain things that are not healthy for our trees. And then chemical, and that's typically accidental issue with trees, some sort of a spray drift or salt spray or those types of things. So a lot of ground to cover, but we're going to go through pretty rapidly. I'm not going to go into all of the specifics about each of these. I just want you to kind of have, I don't know, I think I called it on the first slide. It's like a primer or a scouting guide, really, as to becoming more familiar with some of these particular issues. And then you can always go back later and get more information on that and learn more about that. And so I think we need to start with cultural, because a lot of the issues that we're going to cover as we go through this, I almost put a big number one on this slide and a big number two on the next slide, because they're almost all related back to these first two slides. And so I know you get tired of seeing this particular one, but when we think about cultural conditions with tree, plant selection is the first and foremost thing that we need to consider. And you've seen this map before. In fact, I remember it might have been last week or the week before, we had someone on here talking about it and showed this exact map and talked about why did they just use green across Kentucky, because it's really hard to see these different shades of green. But the thing you need to be aware of is that we just changed, right? In the last couple of years, we have gone up a zone or a half a zone, depending on where you live in Kentucky. And so for my part of the woods over here, we are in a 7A zone. A little bit further west is a 7B. And for those maybe up near Frankfort or more northern areas is a 6B, and that's new territory. So what that should mean is that plants that maybe you couldn't grow before, now you can start growing because they ought to perform. But I would say be careful with that line of thinking. And the reasons why, I just picked two to pull up here, and these are smaller trees. These aren't the big shade trees in the landscape, but the ones that I typically see, and I think that we get caught on this zone idea pretty frequently. Crepe myrtle is one of the main ones, right? People love crepe myrtles. They're a great summer blooming tree. They're not so big that you can't manage them and and feel safe around them. And not, I know some people are really worried about trees failing and falling on homes. It's not going to be an issue with crepe myrtle. But if you look them up and you do a little research on them, you'll see that they're mostly a zone 7 plant. Do people grow crepe myrtle in Frankfort and northern areas? Yes, they do. So what does that mean? Well, it's possible they're growing the ones that came out a few years back out of the Botanical Garden in Washington, D.C. And those were selected and grown to be a zone 6. So technically those should be okay. What I'm just trying to get to the point of here, and we'll just cut to the chase, is that have any of you experienced growing one of these crepe myrtles that gets killed back to the ground? And that can happen, even though it's a zone 7 or maybe one of the zone 6 plants. It doesn't necessarily always ring true. And sometimes we have loss from these trees, or at least killed back to the ground, and then it has to grow back. And on a small tree, that's fine. But just being aware that the plant that you're trying to grow fits this hardiness zone is key. And it's the first step. And that's why I was saying we need a number one on this slide, because you have to get that, you have to grasp that first. Chase tree is another one. It's similar in the way it grows to a crepe myrtle. It's a zone 7 plant. People grow it all over Kentucky. Vitex is the genus, but you get the right winter and it's going to die back to the root. It could die out completely, but typically it dies back to the root. I also listed plants that everybody grows, right? Boxwood, azalea, holly trees, but certain cultivars of those, and I'm thinking specifically right now of hollies. One that we had a lot of damage from. When we get to weather, we'll talk a little bit more about this one. Was Oakland holly that completely defoliated. Well, holly should be hardy here. It shouldn't be an issue, but yet there's always some caveats. There's always some extra things to consider. So the point of this on plant selection, do your research, spend some time. Don't just pick up the first plant you come to, the first tree or shrub that you come to at the box store. Make sure it's going to perform and that it's got a history of performing well in your part of Kentucky. So that's very, very crucial. And we will talk about that periodically as we go through this. The next issue, planting issues, right? As we think about cultural conditions, people still make a lot of mistakes when it comes to planting. And that process doesn't start in the landscape. It starts at plant selection. It starts at the nursery or at the box store or from the source that you buy plants online, wherever, the plant stock that you get it from. That's where the first issue can be encountered and the first remediation can be applied is when you get that plant. Do you take a look at it? Do you ever pull it out of the container and look at the roots in the nursery? Most people don't do that. If it has wrapping and paper around the tree, do you remove that before you bring it home? Or if that's uncomfortable, do you buy it and then maybe take it out to a truck and then do it and then take it back if it's got wounds all over it or big girdling roots and those types of things? So that's the first step whenever you're buying plants, is making sure you're getting good quality plant material, whether that's in a container or whether that's balled and burlap plant material. Once you get it to the home and you get it into the landscape, I don't want to bog us down in this slide because I know you've heard it before, but there are very specific steps to planting tree that if we skip these steps, we are setting ourselves up for other abiotic problems and even other pest problems to occur down the road. Number one that we have to really focus on is the planting hole. Wider is better. Okay, so a nice wide planting hole that's 2 or 3 times the diameter of the root ball is crucial. Putting the exact same soil back into the hole, not amending it with loose potting soil, but putting that same soil back in. But even bigger than both of those is the planting depth, not digging a hole too deep. Okay, and finding out where the flare is on the trunk. So your tree that you purchase should come down and it should flare out at the base of that tree. That flare, where the trunk becomes root, must be at or slightly above the grade of your soil, your existing landscape, your existing lawn. And what tends to happen if we're buying quality material, then you can see that clear. If we're buying less quality material, plant material, it may have a lot of additional soil backfilled over the root ball. Even in the container, they can add more soil. Like if they bump it up another pot size, they're adding more potting soil into that container or bark mix. And so the root flare is getting buried every time that's done. And you get it home and you plant based on the thought that whatever the depth is in the container needs to be the same depth in the soil. And that's just not the case. We have to move that soil back and find that flare and make sure we're planting it at the soil profile of your landscape, or even an inch above the soil profile is fine too. And that's the primary mistake people make, is planting it at the same depth that came from the nursery. We can't do that. And if you dig your hole too deep and you set it in and you realize you're a little too deep, just putting a little soil in there to prop it up isn't good enough either. We've got to have a nice, firm, solid base for that plant to sit on. Otherwise, you're going to have settling and the tree's going to sink. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second in the next slide, why that's an issue. But those are key parts of planting. Wide planting hole, not any deeper, and maybe even a little bit more shallow than the root ball. Removing twine and wire and burlap, if it doesn't compromise and cause the root ball to fall apart, then that's ideal. Take all that off, get it all out of there. And I know you'll see some information that says, well, if you just prune the top half of it, maybe. But some newer information I've seen on galvanized wire cages says they really don't break down in the soil. It takes a very long time, and at some point your roots are going to get impacted by that wire mesh basket underground. So if it's at all possible, the best solution is to take it completely out. All of the material around the root ball should be removed. I think that's it. Pretty much the rest of it's pretty clear, but I have seen many times when people just leave tags on their tree. That's a pretty obvious thing that we should address. We don't have to talk about it with this audience. I think you know that already. So why is too deep an issue? That's the part I want to really harp on with this. Cultural issues is planting too deep. Out of the tree visits that I do, and a lot of county agents do this, we go out and take a look at trees in the landscape. Um, Typically, if a tree has been in the landscape for less than, say, 7 years and it's starting to decline, you're getting dead branches, tip dieback, there's no pathogens, there's no problems that's very obvious that could be causing that, then the clue or the most likely reason for that is being planted too deep. And the clue that tells you that it's too deep is when that tree goes into the ground in a solid, like a telephone pole, in a solid circle, and there's no flare, then we have an issue. And so this is just showing you here kind of the flare of the root ball, how deep underground it is. And that's a problem. And that can happen again. We've already said it came that way from the nursery, or there was root ball settling. Those are the primary reasons. So we have to make sure we're getting that flare at the surface of the soil. Why is that a problem? Aren't roots underground? Why does it matter if they're at the surface or not at the surface? It's because roots still need oxygen. And the deeper you get it in the soil profile, the less amount of oxygen that we have, especially if we have heavy clay soils with poor air, 50%, supposed to be 50% air and 50% soil. And if we don't have much air pore space in the soil, then it's even more of a struggle for those trees. And within 7 years, we can usually see some decline from trees that are planted too deep. So what can you do about it if that's an issue? You can do a root collar excavation. That's just a fancy way of saying dig that dirt back. Do it in a way that doesn't damage the trunk, but just keep raking that dirt back and getting the flare exposed and near the surface, and then putting mulch up around that afterwards. Mulch doesn't cause the same problem as soil. There's plenty of air space in mulch. So rake the soil back, put the mulch back around it. You can give that plant a much better fighting chance. If it's really deep and it's really young, say it's only been in the ground for a year, then it might be possible just to dig it up and raise it up out of the soil and replant that tree again. It might set you back a little bit of time, but it might keep your tree alive longer. So too deep, one of the main issues that we see when we go out to look at a tree. Excessive mulch, I don't think that anybody on this call today is guilty of this, but I know you have seen this, and we've talked about this. We call it a mulch volcano. We talk about this all the time in extension, that this is it's an ineffective way to mulch your trees, right? We got way too much mulch, just like someone took a whole bag and they applied one bag of mulch to every single tree. And rather than spread it out, which would be great, we just pile it up against the trunk of the tree. I call this a copycat crime because people who don't know, that lack of knowledge, see it maybe done at their local box store out in the landscape, or at a fast food place or something, and then they go home and they mulch their trees in the same way. That's not a good a good way to follow that, right? So what are we supposed to be doing? 2 to 4 inches deep, 4 inches at the most, right? Keeping a gap around the tree. Why do we keep a gap around the tree? Because we have these little critters called voles, which are basically a field mouse. And during the wintertime, they can nest up in this big old pile of mulch and stay nice and cozy. And they got a ready food source, all the bark off of your tree. As the wintertime gets here, they can just chew and strip all the bark off of that tree underneath that mulch pile. Don't make it easy for them. Keep a gap. If they have a gap, then hawks and other predators have a better chance of picking those off and keeping them from killing your trees. And remember, wider is better. Leaving this in place the symptoms that you start to see, it might take a long time, but it's going to hold too much moisture to the trunk. So there's could start to be some sort of decay against the trunk of the tree. And when it's this thick and it's a small tree, you're also going to be starting to suffocate some of those roots, and you'll see some decline in the canopy of the tree as well. Um, I would say out of the half of the tree visits that I make, the first group all fit into being planted too deep. The other group fit into this girdling roots group, and this is a big deal. It's something that can be corrected, but it has to be corrected early. So usually whenever I'm looking at a tree and it's got a girdling root, this tree has already been in the landscape for 8, 9, 10 years or more, right? And these big old roots have, instead of growing out and away from the tree, they have decided to turn back toward the tree, and now they are encircling or they're rubbing up against the trunk of the tree. And as the root gets bigger and as the trunk gets bigger over time, they start to impact each other. They start to uh, kind of push into each other. It's like I usually describe it as if you were drinking through a straw and you were squeezing the straw at the same time. It's a restrictive movement of water up throughout the canopy. So the leaves are calling for more water. The roots are trying to send water up. It can't get there. And so what we end up seeing is crown dieback. We have branches dying out in the tree. We may have drought stress symptoms and those types of things occurring. How did that happen? Well, it could have been by avoiding steps number 2, right? Proper planting. Maybe you planted it too deep. That can cause it. Not making a wide planting hole. That can cause it. Mulching, over mulching. So if you have a big old thick layer of mulch up against the trunk of the tree, those roots have got to grow to where there's oxygen. And so they grow back up into that mulch layer. And if they're into that mulch layer, the outside part of that mulch is exposed to air. So they're not going to grow that way. They're going to start to grow around in a circle. And as they do that, you end up with these girdling roots. What can you do about it? What's the corrective action for this? When you buy plants, inspect them, right? Take them out of the pot, move back some of that soil. And if you see some that have already started to girdling, and I know it hurts, but you've got to cut them. You got to get some pruners out and you got to cut those roots and correct it then, and it may never be a problem. If it's an older tree, you can still cut those roots. Like in the white pine picture at the top, that root that's wrapping itself around that tree, that's not too big. You can cut that tree. If you have a lot of them, you need to do it gradually. You can't go cut every single root in one season. You may have to do it over a period of time. If it's a massive root, then that can cause an issue, because if you cut a massive root, you may shock that plant so much that it can't recover. But what's the alternative? Leaving that, you know what the outcome will be eventually from leaving a great big root up against the trunk of the tree. It's either going to keep constricting it until the tree just breaks off at the soil profile one day, or eventually it kills the tree too. So one thing that we've tried when that happens is, rather than trying to cut through a large root like that, is to take a hammer and a chisel and cut just a little V notch in the top part. That way, part of the root is still intact and can still move water, and the other part is starting to die. And that should give the tree enough time to start sending out new feeder roots to replace that root that's going to eventually be dead. It's not perfect, and there's not going to be an easy solution to that, but that's something that we need to avoid. Follow proper planting guidelines and 2 to 4 inches of mulch. And then I threw in that picture at the bottom. I took that of a Leland cypress. This tree was in the landscape for almost 5 years, and it was really starting to show decline. And when we started digging back the mulch and looking underneath it, the entire balled and burlap packaging, the ropes, even the yellow price tag, it's all there. The wire cages, the burlap, the rope. This was not a girdling root problem, but this was a girdling problem because the rope was cutting into it. And I mentioned the tags that we sometimes leave on higher up in the tree. That causes girdling of those branches. That's a pretty easy thing to keep from happening, but people just have to pay attention and do those types of things. And then finally, under this category cultural, we got irrigation. And we all know when you plant trees, they need some water. You need water to settle that soil and get any big air pockets out away from the root system, because that can cause some stress to the plant. I call it mudding in, but you basically make a slurry of soil and water as you're planting the tree, and that gets good soil to root contact that way. But those first 3 years after you plant a tree is a crucial time in the life of that tree to be able to get adequate water. And if it doesn't, um, it's going to start to show symptoms, right? Because keep in mind, whenever it's dug from a nursery, you don't get the whole root system. You get all the tree, but you don't get much of the root system with that. And so it's trying to regrow all new roots. And so one of the things that can really help with that is getting additional irrigation to it. I put a couple of pictures on this slide. That one on the bottom is called it's a commercial brand. It's called Tree Gator. It's basically a double line bag. You fill it full of water, and it's got these little drip emitters on the bottom, and you zip it up around your tree, fill it up, and it will slowly release, I don't know, maybe like 8 gallons of water or so around the tree. They make another one. It's kind of low brown looking donut thing that's right on the surface of the ground. Those are good. Things like that are good, but they're really only good for that first season, because after that, hopefully your roots are moving out away from the tree. Or if you have mature trees that seem to be drought stressed because of soil issues, which we'll get to, then you need to switch to something else, because you need to put the water where the feeder roots are. So after planting, they're right next to the tree. But as the tree gets bigger, they move out away. So we typically think wherever the drip line is, wherever the outer branches are of the tree, that's where those feeder roots are. So that's where we want to be putting irrigation. And soaker hoses do a good job of that. Don't use shallow watering like a sprinkler that moves back and forth. That's going to cause more problems than good. You need to really let it soak and go deep into the soil. Other things you can do is amending the soil, but I think I'll talk more about that in just a second. If you want more information on irrigation, we actually have um, a presentation, a video on that topic more in depth as well. Okay, so we've got a different color. We're moving to a different type of condition that can cause these abiotic problems, and this is all related to soils. And for us, soil type is a big deal, because we have a lot of soils in Kentucky that are clay. In some cases, very heavy clay. That doesn't mean they're poor soils, because they can have a lot of nutrients in that clay soil. That's really good, but sometimes it doesn't allow the soil to drain very well. Sometimes it's what we call a tight soil, and it doesn't have much air space inside that soil, and that can cause more issues with droughts, and flooding, and then also nutrition availability too. The nutrients are there, but the airspace and the root availability and moving throughout that soil isn't allowing the nutrients to be accessed as easily. So the easiest thing to do when you go to plant a tree is amending the soil with organic matter. Now, we're not talking about in the hole, we're talking about over a large area. So picture, if you can, just picture you're putting in a whole new row of shrubs, okay? And if you're going to do that, instead of digging individual holes and planting 5 shrubs for like a hedge or something, it would be better, if it's possible, to work up that 100 foot of space or 50 foot of space, whatever it's going to be, to work that all up with a rototiller and add an inch, 2 inch, 3, the more the better, organic matter, and then till that in. And you can really improve the drainage, the water holding capacity, the nutrition of that soil, making some amendments that way. You will not have the same effect by putting that compost or organic matter into the planting hole. If you do that in a clay soil, then you cause other problems with girdling roots, poor water drainage. The plant will not do well. Okay, so, and then the other option here is just going back to slide 1, tree selection, looking for plants that don't care. They don't mind soils that are poorly drained. They don't mind soils that are maybe not have as much higher levels of organic matter. But if you want those plants that do, then you have to make some changes to your soil types, typically, at least here, right? At least in my part of the state, you do. If not, you end up with stuff like this. And so here's some junipers that are just not doing great. And that's because the soil is not perking well. It's not allowing water movement through the soil. This is a really big issue if you're trying to grow azaleas or blueberries or rhododendrons. Those plants cannot take being planted in soil that doesn't allow water to move away from the roots. If that soil tightly holds on to moisture and stays wet for long periods of time, they're going to look like this. They're going to turn yellow, they're going to start having dieback, and they're just not going to do well. Plant selection or amending the soil is how you get around that problem. Another issue that we see sometimes, a lot of times, is compaction, and we typically see this in new home construction. They love after all the work is done. Of course, before they started, they raked off all your topsoil and they put it in a big old pile, and then they bring all this heavy equipment in and they dig your footers or your basement and they pack this soil and then they bring your topsoil back in and just drop it right back on top of this soil that's been run over by bulldozers and backhoes and everything else, right? This is not a good condition. We're going to have future issues. It looks good and it's easy to level out that topsoil, but you basically have two soil profiles now. You've got just your topsoil that you move back in that hopefully was good topsoil to begin with. So they move it back in, but then there's this hard pan. It's this hard layer of compacted soil right underneath. And I guarantee they're not putting a foot of topsoil back down because there wasn't that much to begin with, most likely. So you got like 2 inches of topsoil, you got a hard pan, and then you got hard compacted clay soil that has little to no airspace inside. Um, you're going to have a lot of problems with plants. And if you already had existing trees in that area, those are going to start showing symptoms very quickly. So there's some things you can do. If you're doing your home construction, if you're having a home built, you can be involved in this from the beginning, right? And so you can let them do all the leveling because you want your yard leveled. You want it to slope away from the house correctly. But before the topsoil gets pulled back on, it needs to be worked up again. It needs to be tilled up, and it could be a lot of area, I understand, but maybe just around the house needs to be tilled up. Then the topsoil can be brought back in, or maybe it can be amended with additional organic matter and worked in. If you could break up that just that level, that top level of hard soil, and then incorporate some of the old organic matter and old topsoil back in, you're going to be miles ahead for the plant materials. Any plant that you're going to plant in that landscape is going to do way better, right? But we don't always get to do that. We don't always build our own homes, and we might buy a home that's been treated this way, and so we come in with issues. So what do you do in that situation when you know your soil doesn't perk well and you're not sure how to fix it? Well, one thing you could try is a lawn tool called a core aerator. And this is called vertical mulching, basically. What it does, it has a hollow tube and it's a self-propelled machine, and you push that across your yard. Not now when it's been really, really dry, at least in West Kentucky, but move across your yard in different directions, and it will pull these cores out of the ground and throw them up on the top of the soil. Then go back in with topsoil and work that across the soil profile with like a rake or a tool or some piece of equipment or something. And basically, you're mulching in vertical columns all over your yard. That could help. It's difficult, but it could help. If you have a tree you're concerned about that's declining and you determine that it's just the soil is too tight, it's too hard, it's too compacted, you could contract an arborist to come and do some radial trenching. And so what this is basically a huge tool. That's not true. It's not a huge tool, but it's a tool that's connected to a huge air compressor, and it's called an air spade, and there's some other brands out there, and they blow soil out away from your tree. They may do the entire area, or they may do it in these trenches out away from the tree, and then they can bring organic matter back in, and you will see almost immediate results from a tree that's declining from hard compacted soils to putting out new growth and doing much better for you in the landscape. And then we already talked about tilling organic matter option. That works best and right at the beginning. If you've already got an existing landscape, that's going to be very difficult to do unless you do it on a smaller scale, amending planting beds, for example. And this is what you end up with, of course. So here's an existing oak tree that was out by this pond. And of course, lots of heavy equipment was moved back and forth and it compacted the soil. And now a tree that was doing well before is starting to show very, typical symptoms of dieback in the crown. And that will probably continue. And hopefully the tree can overcome that. But this is directly tied to a compaction issue for this tree. Another thing, and you could put this one under mechanical if you wanted to, but it's changes in water flow. The number of oh, now I forgot the name. it looks like a boxwood, and I forgot the name of it. Japanese hollies. There he goes. Japanese hollies. They're a small shrub. They look very similar to boxwood, but the number of those that I have diagnosed at the base of a downspout, it almost always is there. And it's not just those, it's other plants too. Yews or taxus is another one that cannot take that. So if you are not getting your water moved away from your plant and you're using something like the Japanese holly that cannot tolerate that much water, you're going to have problems. Of course, that leads to a disease issue, which kind of muddies the water for our topic today, but it's caused because of a soil condition. The water's being diverted into that. And it might be that it's an easy fix, right? You just put an extender out and you get the water out away from that plant and you can avoid that problem. But in some cases, it just may be the way your yard is sloped and water is pulling up and moving back toward the house, and you may have to do something more drastic, like a total regrading of the yard. But hopefully it doesn't come to that. But typically where we see this changes in water flow, it has to do with downspouts. Or you add on to the house and now you've got these new downspouts and they've got to go somewhere and you already had existing plants and these two don't like each other and you have issues in time with that. Grade changes is another. I don't get this call as often, but I have seen this many times. And I tell when I teach botany class for master gardeners, I tell about tulip poplar tree that we saw once that they had backfilled around. They changed the grade of the soil. They backfilled in with over a foot and a half of soil. The entire canopy, after a period of years, had died, and the only thing left was epicormic shoots coming off of the trunk of the tree with leaves. I mean, a tulip poplar leaf should be this tall or this wide, right? But we're talking about leaves that are this big, like a foot across. And that was basically the last ditch effort of that tree trying to get enough photosynthesis to survive. And of course, it can't survive that. This is a pretty involved process if you need to make that big of a change. And you can just see in this diagram, we won't even go over that, but the take-home message for this slide on grade changes is if you're moving dirt around on your property, you need to limit that to about 3 inches. Anything greater of 3 inches, that's 3 inches being moved in or 3 inches being moved out. You need to probably consider a couple of different options here. For protecting that tree, and it's probably going to need an arborist help to be able to do it correctly. So it'll either be like a tree well or a tree terrace. Just an example of something. I mean, here's a tree. I guess they were trying to save this tree, but that tree does not have a chance really. There's too much topsoil's been moved away from that tree. You can see the drop there at the base of the tree. This was a client of mine here in Hopkinsville that had put in a pool for right underneath this oak tree. And we talked about terracing and how you need to protect the tree's root system. So this was his do-it-yourself method at that. And this tree died. This was definitely not how you do a tree terrace. It needed to be a lot more root system, but he really didn't have the space for that. So there are right ways and wrong ways to do it. And rather than just going in there and trying something, you need to have someone that knows how to do those things correctly if it's important enough to protect that tree. Okay, change. Nope, we're still in soil. Soil conditions, nutrient deficiency. Just to point out that sometimes things are very confusing, and we might think it's a disease issue with spots or discoloration in the leaves that may actually be tied to a nutritional problem. And we know that all plants, trees included, need a certain amount of nutrients for proper growth. So the only way you're going to know if you're getting the right amount of nutrients for your tree is to do a soil test. So yeah, even with trees, I know we think about it with vegetable gardens and your lawn, but even your trees need to have a soil test, and not even that often, maybe every 5 years or so, just to know that the right amount of nutrients are in the soil. And you can go a step beyond that and have the leaves, the foliage analyzed too. UK doesn't do that test, but there's private labs that do. It's not super expensive, and you pick leaves off of your tree and you send this bag of leaves to them and they analyze them and tell you, well, how much nutrients are actually making it from the soil to the leaves. And that can be very helpful too. One that I'll just point out when it comes to nutrient deficiency is pin oaks. And so pin oaks, people like those trees. They're a fast growing oak tree. but they have an iron deficiency issue, and it's usually not actually a lack of iron in the soil. We tend to have enough iron in our soils. What it's really an issue with is pH. And without going too much more in depth, by doing a soil test, you would know if the pH is out of whack, and you can make your adjustments, and the tree would get all of the iron that it needs, and you wouldn't have this problem. But my point for this slide is, if you can see in the little inset picture there, you can see these little spots starting to show up, and people get convinced that that's a disease, but it's really just the progression of that iron deficiency in this tree. It should not be yellow. It should be green. So that's a good sign that you've got a nutritional deficiency. Okay, this next section, we're going to switch to some biological conditions that can cause issues for trees. And I'll just tell you from the beginning, this is kind of this is your point to catch your breath. I know I'm giving you a lot of information here really, really quickly. For the next few slides, there's not a thing you can do about any of these. So just rest and just learn and be interested in these things, right? This is a picture I took of a dwarf Alberta spruce. And this would fit into the category of genetic anomalies. And so basically what you're seeing here, and this happens, I won't say frequently, but it's not uncommon for a dwarf Alberta spruce to have a side shoot that will come out that's a different spruce altogether, right? And it's not necessarily grafted. It's just genetics. Something happened in the plant, and we don't know why that happens. But we call that a reversion. Sometimes it can be a different color. Sometimes the fruit can look different, or the bloom might be different. And sometimes we enjoy that. Sometimes it's great. Other times this doesn't work. The homeowner let this one go a little too long. Otherwise, he could have pruned out this side shoot and continued on, and it may never do it again. But for whatever reason, it decided to put out a different type of tree off of the same plant. If that's a problem, you can also replace the plant. But just as a side note, when this happened, I talked to Dr. Dunwell, who was one of our hort specialists, and he told me that this is oftentimes how new cultivars come into being. That a plant will produce some sort of unusual growth or fruit or something, and it's nice, it's pleasing, we like it, and so people take cuttings and they regrow that. So I put as another corrective action is, hey, just grow your own plant, create something different. That's how these things come about. Um, I liked this slide because we get some hard words up here for you: leaf abscission and marserescence. So basically what we're talking about is leaf drop and leaf retention. And we get this call, or I get this call pretty frequently, especially on white pine. White pine is supposed to be an evergreen, right? Why am I losing all these needles? Well, there can be some reasons for that, but also keep in mind that evergreen trees doesn't mean that they're always going to be green forever. It just means that they're green during the winter time. So maybe we should probably reclassify and call them all winter greens instead, because they do have a leaf cycle, and it's much longer than a deciduous tree, right? So if you have a white pine tree and some other evergreen trees, hemlock does this as well, and it's the interior needles further back on the branches that's 2 or 3 years old that are turning yellow and dropping off. That's natural. There's nothing you have to do. It's just a normal tree function. It's what it does, right? So you need to recognize and learn what is normal about your tree. So learning about your tree can be something that you could do. On the flip side of that, I know I get this call too. It's more of a curiosity. It's not a problem, but people fuss about oak trees in general. And beech trees do this to some extent too, where they just won't drop their leaves. They just hang on to them, and they don't come off until next year when the new buds for the new leaves push them off. That's just what they do. It's called marserescence, and I did a little bit of research on that, and that the Latin word means to shrivel, and they hang on there. They know how leaves are supposed to drop off, but scientists don't understand why they won't do it. So no one has an answer for that one either. That's okay. Galls and burls. Just be careful here on this one. When we think about galls, sometimes those are caused by insects, and sometimes they're caused by diseases. Burls are probably a better term for what we see on these big knots that form on the side of trees. We don't really know why that happens either. Sometimes they can be triggered by a pest, but then they continue and they grow into this burl. What should you do about it? Nothing. Just watch them, look at them. They don't harm the tree in any way, so they're They're just unusual. They're just a biological condition. Here's one that you can address. Okay, branch architecture. Some trees have a tendency to form forked branches, right? A forked trunk. And if that's left unchecked, if you aren't properly pruning that tree and training that tree when it's young, then you can get something that looks similar to what's in this slide here. And so here we have a lot of branches, and we call those codominant branches. And when it was younger, at some point in this tree, and I will just go on to say maple because they're like the most guilty of this out of all trees, I think. You'll have the main trunk that comes up, and then there'll be two little buds at the top. And instead of one of those buds growing up and one being a side branch, it doesn't do that. Instead, it forks, and then it will continue to grow up into two forks. And why that's a problem is that that material in between those two forks touch, but they don't mesh. They don't include each other. They don't move together. They're pushed up against each other, and over time, they can actually push themselves apart. Or if you get a heavy wind load or a heavy snow or ice load, it can pull them apart in that way too. So that's a problem. And it's an easily fixed problem when it's young, but when it's older, it's a much more difficult problem to address. So just be aware when you're planting young trees, you've got trees less than 5, 6 years old in the landscape, you can go and fix that now. If it's way up in the top of the canopy, don't worry about it. It's only an issue when we're looking at the trunk. So make those adjustments. If it's a big tree and but it's an important tree to you, then you might have to look at having an arborist come out and doing something like cabling and bracing. Don't try this on your own, right? It has to be done in the right way, and it has to be maintained. It can't just be put in and then left. They have to come back and make adjustments to it. It's an investment, but it's worth it for a tree that maybe is crucial to your landscape, and you just want to make sure it doesn't split apart one day, right? Okay, this next group is all about weather conditions. Um, there's a lot that can go on related to weather, and all of these are out of our control, weather conditions, but there's some things we can do to make sure our plants recover well or maybe don't have to undergo quite as many of these problems. So we'll start with low temperatures first, and there's really two different types of those causes. One is a sudden drop in temperature, which we call a chilling injury, and the other one is freezing injury, which is sub-freezing temperatures. Out of these, the chilling injury seems to cause the most damage, but typically the plant can recover better from that. But when we get into temperatures, sub-freezing temperatures, and that goes back to number one again, slide number one, looking at plant selection and thinking about our hardiness zone. When we dip below what everyone is saying now is a 6B or a 7, we're going to have some dieback. We're going to have some major, maybe the entire top part of the plant die. And the roots might still be hardy, but we're going to see some major damage out of that. So plant selection is still crucial. Chilling injury, the sudden drop in temperature. I'm sure most of you remember that. I think the term we're using is polar vortex in December of 21, maybe. I think it was 21. And we're still recovering from that. We had boxwoods, we had holly trees, we had all kinds of plants that were not ready for dormancy, and we had a sudden drop in temperature, and we had trunk split, we had bark split, we had buds die, we had twig die back, we had a lot of problems. Most of those cultivars were the ones that we're talking about. I mean, we made a lot of visits that next year, and I can't tell you how many boxwood hedges I looked at that had 2 or 3 unaffected boxwoods and then a dead one. And after asking and probing questions about these, finding out that that one was replaced with a different type of boxwood or vice versa. They weren't the same cultivars. And that particular cultivar was not able to survive that chilling injury. Most of the time, though, and at least with our hollies here on the property, they grew out of it. Eventually, it took over almost 2 years, but they eventually grew out of it. Anyway, that goes back to plant selection, making sure your plants are getting the maximum amount of health. So what's that mean? Well, it means irrigation when it's dry. It means fertilizer if the nutrients is off and you've done your soil test. When you think about new planting, avoiding frost pockets for any of those marginally hardy plants. Don't plant in low spots because frost tends to settle. If you were growing an orchard, which is a different topic, that would be a no-no anyway, but that goes the same for trees and shrubs as well. I put a picture of Jane Magnolia. People around here love Jane Magnolia, and it is very, very pretty. But we get a bloom maybe one out of every 3 years, maybe out of every 4 years, because those buds they get killed by some sort of late freeze. Or really a better way to say is they come out of dormancy too soon in the spring, and a lot of plants do that. So just be aware. Maybe Jane's not really the best selection. It's certainly a hardy tree, but the buds just aren't that hardy. Winter desiccation. So this is caused when it's the middle of winter. Plants should be in some sort of dormant stage and temperatures start to warm up. That's pretty common for Kentucky. So the temperatures get warmer. Maybe we have a lot of wind, and basically the leaves dry out. The moisture is leaving through the stomata in the leaves. The roots are dormant, so there's no water being sent through the vascular system to replace that. And what the symptoms that we get tend to look a little bit like drought stress. This is especially a bigger problem for broadleaf evergreens. So think rhododendrons, cherry laurels, southern magnolia, marginally hardy for Kentucky, right? We're going to see this pretty frequently on southern magnolia. It's not going to kill the plant, but you're going to have some dieback. You're going to have a lot of leaf drop. You can do some things about it. You can use these anti-transparents like wilt proof. I don't know anybody that ever does that, but you could. Again, plant selection and then mulch can help regulate the soil temperatures. But when it's really the middle of winter and the soils are frozen, even the mulch isn't going to help that much, right? Frost heaving, I think we can kind of skip this one, but it basically, just the point is that we have a freeze and thaw cycle throughout all of our winter. And so the moisture freezes. And if you've got a newly planted tree or shrub, it can actually start to push and lift that out of the ground over those cycles, right? There's not really a way you can avoid that. You can make sure you get it planted correctly, that it's not too shallow in the soil. But the point here is that in the spring of the year, you should do a really good inspection of all your plants. And if anybody needs to be replanted or more soil or mulch put back around them, then you can fix that problem before it becomes a problem. Snow and ice. Oh, it's almost time. And at least for us, we don't really get an excessive amount of snow anymore. At least it doesn't seem like it, but we still get a lot of ice. And the question that always follows after a big ice event, once people get electricity restored, then this question follows is, should I go out and beat my trees and get all this ice off of it? No, don't do that. Your branches are frozen. And if you beat the ice off of the branches, you're going to cause damage to the bark, to the cambium layer on those branches, and you're going to cause death to those branches. They won't survive that. Let the ice melt naturally. If we ever do get a snow load and you've got shrubs and things that are weighted down, if you can carefully remove the snow, do that. I don't know. Maybe that will happen again one day in our lifetime, but it doesn't seem to be a normal event anymore. But ice always is an issue for us. And of course, expect a lot of damage. There's always going to be breakage. And so just doing some corrective pruning, which is a different talk, but pruning broken limbs back correctly will really help that tree recover quickly. And also taking a look now and seeing if there's things that need to be pruned before we could potentially have more ice load this winter. This is the big one. We get this one quite often. The damage is caused during the winter, but doesn't show up typically until the summer when people start to see it. So what we're talking about is sun scald or frost cracking. They work very similar, though they're slightly different in what they do to the tree. But they're caused, again, warms up during the wintertime. There's a lot of sunlight low in the sky. It's heating up that side of the tree. The tree cells underneath this bark start becoming active, and they're going to need moisture. They need water. And so they start calling for water to be sent up from the root system. The roots are asleep. They're not active. They're not pumping any water. The ground may be frozen. There may be no water to send. The roots, the stem cells continue to be active, and eventually they die because there is no water, and they die, and you end up with a sunken area in the cambium layer of the tree, and it looks like that picture there on the left. Frost cracks very similar, typically on bigger trees, but it's a big vertical split in the trunk of the tree, and it can be somewhat deep into the tree. Hopefully, with a frost crack, new growth tissue will start to enclose over time and kind of compartmentalize that. But sometimes trees can be severely damaged from a frost crack as well. What do you do about that? Well, the bigger trees you're probably not going to be able to do anything about. But for younger trees, thin bark trees, use a light colored tree wrap and wrap it from the base all the way up. You can buy them on a little spool like at the box stores, or you can order it online, and they're reusable. You can wrap it all the way up to the top branches, put it on in late fall or even December or so for us, and then take it back off about March. Don't leave it on year round. Take it back off, put it away, do it again first couple of years. After that, you should be okay. It should have enough woodier type, thicker material that it would protect itself. This is one of the reasons why you still see some people painting latex paint, white paint on the trunks of their trees. It should be diluted with water. Um, that's up to you. That's personal preference. It's not going to hurt the tree. It will give you the same effect of protecting it from sun scald, but that one can last a lot longer. So if you're not a big fan of that whitewashing on your trees, you might want to stick with with the wrap. And then what we're into right now, of course, is drought and heat stress. And that one's pretty obvious, although it can be confused sometimes with diseases. If anybody grows Japanese maples, and especially the lacier, particular, they have a lot more indentations on their leaves. There's just a lot more surface area on that leaf, margin area on that leaf. We get all kinds of burn, and it for many people, it can look like some sort of disease is taking out their Japanese maple. But that is just an excessive amount of water loss. And so it has been until this week, it's been really, really hot and really dry. And so not enough water going into the leaves. The leaves are evaporating too much, and you get tip burn all over the plant. That's moisture stress, right? So what can you do for that? Well, that should be pretty obvious. We need to water those plants, right? For plants that are prone to that, like the Japanese maples, the lacy ones, maybe put that in a protected location, which means maybe they don't need afternoon direct sunlight. That would probably be pretty tough for a lacy one like that in Kentucky. If they could get morning sun and maybe a tree or something protects them in the afternoon, they'll probably do a lot better for you. This is also not the right time of the year to do pruning when it's under stress. So delay any sort of pruning that you felt like needed to be done to those trees. Flooding, I'm going to say the chances are if you have cyclical or every year annual flooding to an area, you probably are already aware of that. But what that means is you need to plant the right plants for that area. So the one that pops immediately into my mind is something like a bald cypress or a pond cypress. Beautiful trees, and they don't care. They can grow in temporarily flooded sites, right? Where whatever this tree here is obviously not doing really well, right? So selecting the right plant material. I don't think that's going to be a real big thing for most people, but this can be, and you never know. This is one you can't prepare for or plan for, but some big summer storm moves through and a big old bolt of lightning strikes your tree. The damage on this is all over the board. I've seen cottonwood trees where all the bark on that side of the tree it's just thrown everywhere. It's thrown, several hundred feet away from the tree. And then something like this julep poplar I saw in Logan County, that no damage to the trunk. I mean, sorry, to the tree itself. There's no bark shed off of the tree. It's just this straight line that went straight down through the tree. And so that always brings the question, well, is my tree going to die? Got no idea. I have no way of knowing that. And really that's because the damage varies so widely. We know that certain trees, like cottonwood, for example, has so much moisture in its wood, most times it's just going to be okay. This tulip poplar, difficult to know. if it's going to recover. Sometimes the tree will be dead within a week. It'll just flat out die very rapidly. Other times, no damage at all. It continues, it compartmentalizes the wound and continues to grow and last forever and ever. And then other times, and this is the most frustrating one, is it does great for a couple of years and then it just dies. Can't help you. There's not any way to give a direct answer to that. All I can tell you to do if it gets struck by lightning is to clean up the damaged area. That means cutting off any loose bark or anything that would keep the tree from growing closure wood over top of the wound. Cut that off. It's going to need additional water. If you're not getting adequate rainfall, you're going to need to irrigate. And typically when plants get like a disease problem, we tell you don't fertilize because it's under stress. But when you need a tree to compartmentalize and start to close up that wound, in any of these cases that we're talking about today, many times the remedy is to fertilize that tree, to give it some fertilizer to help it to close up that growth, or to grow over the wound, I meant to say. So fertilizer can be helpful. There are particular ways to fertilize trees, and we have a publication on that. You should refer to that before you just go and try to fertilize your trees. But that can be one way to help it recover. Okay, here's another break for us. This animal conditions. I don't think you need my help in figuring out that animals can cause damage to trees. You've seen that, but I've got some interesting pictures to show you as well. For me, what we typically see are these two: deer damage. If you live in an area that's got a heavy deer population and you plant new trees, don't be surprised if they come along and eat the tops out of all your trees. That's what deers do in the wintertime. So you need to put some sort of a cage up that's taller than your tree to protect them, to keep them from being eaten so that they can get some growth on them and get high enough, right? That doesn't help if you've got a lot of woods and deers are rubbing their antlers on the tree. I guess you could keep the tree cage on forever, but that may not be very effective and probably distracts from your landscape. Rabbits can cause a lot of damage, though typically I don't see that much damage unless we get a lot of snowfall. And again, we don't really get a lot of snowfall. Things have got to be pretty rough for rabbits to start eating the bark off the tree, but they will do it. And maybe you've had more experience with that than me. So habitat reduction can help. If you got a lot of rabbits around your property, maybe they're there for a reason. Do you have a bunch of branches piled up and they're using that to nest in? That could be a source of your problem. So you might need to make some adjustments there. I put repellents on here. I don't know. You can try them. The only thing I'd say about repellents is that if you are going to try them, you need to keep reapplying them because they do not last very long. Some people swear by them and say they're excellent. Others say I couldn't tell. I put the repellent out and it was like they enjoyed the plant even more. I throw this slide in. This is something that I get a lot of calls on, and people think a boar has drilled holes into their tree. So the diagnostic for that is asking if they're in straight lines. Are they in a straight line? And is there an even space between each one of these holes? And the answer is yes. Then actually you're probably looking at damage caused by a sapsucker, which is a type of woodpecker, right? So they drill these holes in the tree. Generally, they don't cause enough damage to kill a tree. Okay, so the gaps in there allow for the flow of water and nutrients throughout the tree. In fact, that's why they do it. It allows the nutrients to pull up. That sugary sap brings in other insects, and then the sapsuckers come back and eat the insects and drink some of the sap. So they're basically farming on the side of your tree. But I haven't seen trees. I've seen branches die from too much feeding, but I haven't seen the tree die outright. This is one, fortunately, I haven't had to deal with yet. This is an Armormachia tree, and this is squirrel damage. So they're chewing the bark off of the tree. That's a bad deal. And squirrels are pretty pesky, so that's going to be a problem if you've got a lot of squirrels. If they decide to start chewing the bark off of your tree, it's probably going to be a thinner bark tree like this one. What I typically see or associate with squirrel damage is in the spring of the year when people call and they've got little branches that are maybe about a foot or less in length and there's still green leaves on it and they've all been chewed off of the trees. Yeah, squirrels do that too. They just do stuff. Right now they're eating holes in all my garbage cans. So, they just do things. Okay, we're near the end. Mechanical conditions, just a couple of points about this. Root damage. This is things that we do to trees. So digging around trees, trenching near trees, tilling in the root zone, all of these things cause damage to the root system, and we need to avoid it. Really, if at all possible, we need to stay outside that drip line. What if you want to plant some flowers under the tree? That's fine. You can dig a little hole, and I know you're going to hit a root or two. That's fine, but it's probably not a great idea. It's not a great idea to take a big rototiller and go around your tree and till up 6 to 8 inches into the soil. You're going to kill a lot of root system doing that. Equally, and sometimes outside of your control, is if municipalities are trying to put in a sidewalk and they need to cut a trench, or they need to rerun a gas line or something else, and they cut a trench next to the tree. The further away from the tree, the better, right? But the closer to the tree, the more root loss you're gonna have, and you're gonna have extensive root loss if that is done. They can tunnel under the roots of trees because roots are not that deep. 16 inches on average is the depth of roots, except for the taproot for some trees, which is generally right underneath the tree. The mass that holds this tree and keeps it going typically isn't much deeper than 16 inches or so. So it's possible to go under the roots of the trees, but you've got to convince them to do that, and it costs additional money. So that's working with your utilities to get that done. Mowing injury, come on, we know better, right? You got a tree, but you don't have a mulch ring around it. And either you or someone you hire comes to mow it, and they hit it with that string trimmer every time, and it causes this big canker to form, which leads to disease problems. Or they whack it with the front of the push mower. These are all things that's easily avoided, but we term these as all mechanical conditions, mechanical issues. So mulch for future avoidance if you've got this issue, additional water during stress periods, and fertilize, trying to get it to compartmentalize. I would say this picture itself also shows not much of a flare going on, so there may be additional problems happening here. Okay, we're on the home stretch now, just a couple left. Chemical conditions, salt injury. You've probably have seen this. If you haven't seen it in your own landscape, I'm sure you've seen it driving down the parkways or interstates. When salt trucks come and they spray the road in preparation for an ice event, um, a lot of that salt spray can drift off. And if there's trees growing near that, you won't notice it then, but next year you'll see a lot of brown tissue on the tree. That's from salt spray. It can also happen on your own property if you're salting your walks and you've got trees and things that are along your sidewalks or your driveway. The runoff from that can get into the root zone. I diagnosed a maple tree 2 weeks ago, and I was not thinking of salt runoff because it was a gravel driveway. But the homeowner eventually, I kept looking at the leaf and I thought, this is not a disease. This looks like burn. And the homeowner did say that they salted their gravel driveway, which I hadn't heard of that being done before. Uh, and this particular property, the gravel driveway was slightly higher than the maple tree. So all of that runoff just was going straight into the root zone of that tree. And that's what you get with it, that salt runoff. What can you do about it? You can try to flush the soils. If it was a mistake, something got poured out there, you can try to flush the soils. I don't know how effective that would be. You can also pick plants that don't care about salt. That's not an issue for them. And I listed just 3 there, but if you do some research, you'll find there's quite a few that salt's not an issue for those. A lot of our evergreens, though, it's an issue. They don't like that. And so if you've got those on your property, maybe switch to other things for de-icing materials that don't cause that problem. I hear people say kitty litter works just as well. I would think it would be a little bit more messy. I don't know how well it's going to do it melting, but it gives you traction to walk on. So consider that. Consider some of the options too that don't cause that problem. Last one is on herbicides. Typically, we're talking about a non-target application. So someone who maybe sprays their yard for broadleaf weeds or has a firm come and do that, a company that comes and does that on a hot day. The 2,4-D or other chemicals, dicamba and things might volatilize, turn to a vapor, drift up and contact your trees and shrubs that are nearby. and you get symptoms like what we see in these pictures here. You get this cupping and curling. One of the corrective actions is if you're spraying and you accidentally spray a shrub, for example, wash it off immediately as much as you can. Just keep pouring it on the plant. You might be able to get rid of enough of the material, maybe. The other option is using activated charcoal, and the rate is 2 pounds per 100 square feet, worked into a 6-inch depth to kind of pull some of the chemical up out of the soil that may have been applied around the base of a plant. But ultimately, when it comes to herbicide injury, you just have to wait and see if the tree can recover from that. And I think most cases, when it comes to tree, you may have a branch or two that has to be pruned off, but they typically overcome. I will say again, maples, and I've hit on maples a lot. Maples and Roundup do not mix. We've got a lot of research material out of the Princeton Research Center that shows the type of damage that you get from using Roundup around the base or glyphosate around the base of maple trees. It causes some long-term health effects to those trees. So be careful. Don't just willy-nilly apply herbicides. And if you have a firm do it, someone to come in and treat your yard, make sure it's not on a day when the temperatures are approaching 90 and the wind's blowing like crazy. That's going to increase your risk for the herbicide injury. That was a lot. I realize it was a lot to throw at you, but we did make it to the end. And I just kind of wanted to share some of these, what we call abiotic. So it means they're not insects, they're not diseases, but they can cause some problems. And I would say that maybe even more so than all the rest of the problems, maybe even combined. If you were to combine all the insect and disease problems, you're probably going to be dealing more with abiotic issues in your home landscape. So I know this a lot, and I know that you weren't expected to be able to diagnose everything this way, but just think about this as kind of just a guide, a beginning point to look at some of the issues. And going from here, you might be able to save a few trees and shrubs on your property.